There's a kind of silence that feels different. It doesn't just sound like distance. It feels like something unfinished, something unspoken, something sitting just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment that never comes. And if you've ever been on the receiving end of that silence, you already know how confusing it is because it doesn't feel like closure. It doesn't feel like rejection in the way people usually describe it. It feels like something was there, something real, and yet somehow it just stopped without explanation. And that's the part that keeps you thinking, not because you don't understand what happened on the surface, but because something inside you keeps telling you that there's more they didn't say, more they didn't show, more they felt but couldn't express. And the hardest part is not knowing whether that feeling is real or just something you're holding on to because you need answers. But what if the silence isn't empty? What if it's actually full of things they were too afraid to say? Because the truth is, for someone who struggles with emotional closeness, silence is rarely about not caring. It's often about not knowing how to handle what they feel. It's about being overwhelmed by something they don't fully understand themselves. And instead of trying to explain it, instead of risking saying the wrong thing or exposing too much, they disappear into the one place that feels safe to them: distance. Not because it's what they truly want, but because it's what they know how to control. And if they could send you one message, one honest, unfiltered message without fear, without pride, without all the internal walls they've built, it wouldn't sound the way you expect. It wouldn't be perfectly clear or confidently expressed. It would be messy. It would be hesitant. It would carry contradictions. But most importantly, it would reveal something you were never meant to fully see. Because deep down, there's a part of them that never really disconnected the way it looked. There's a part of them that still thinks about you in moments you'd never imagine. Not in a dramatic, constant way, but in quiet flashes. In things that remind them of how things felt when it was easy, when it was natural, before things got complicated, before emotions started asking more from them than they knew how to give. And if they could say it without feeling exposed, without feeling like they're losing control, the message would begin simply. It would sound like this: I never stopped thinking about you. Not in a way that demands anything, not in a way that tries to pull you back in, but in a way that admits something they've been holding back from even themselves. Because for them, thinking about you isn't the problem. Feeling something isn't the problem. The problem is what those feelings require. Because every time they get close to expressing it, something inside them pulls them back. Something reminds them of the risk, of what it means to open that door again, of how quickly things can shift from feeling safe to feeling overwhelming. Som that versamhet av forvitning fighten. And that's the part most people never see. They assume that silence means peace, that distance means clarity, that moving on looks clean and straightforward. But for someone who avoids emotional vulnerability, it rarely works like that. Because the feelings don't just disappear. They get pushed aside. They get buried under distractions, routines, new experiences, anything that keeps them from having to sit with what's still unresolved. And yet, it doesn't fully go away. It shows up in the moments when they're alone, when there's nothing to distract them, when something small triggers a memory they didn't expect, and for a second, they feel it again. Not the entire connection, not everything all at once, but just enough to remind them that it mattered more than they allowed themselves to admit. And that's where the conflict begins. Because missing you doesn't automatically lead to action. In fact, for them, it often leads to the opposite. They feel the pull, but instead of moving toward it, they step back. Because reaching out doesn't just mean sending a message, it means opening something they've been trying to keep closed. It means risking a response they can't control. It means stepping into a space where they might have to explain themselves, where they might have to feel more than they're ready for. And for someone who values emotional control above everything, that feels dangerous, so they stay silent. Not because they don't care, but because caring puts them in a position they don't know how to handle. And that's why their silence can feel so confusing, because it doesn't match the connection you experienced. It doesn't align with the way things felt when you were together. It leaves you questioning whether it was ever real, whether you imagined the depth, whether you misread everything. But the truth sits somewhere in between, because what you felt was real. But so is their fear. And those two things don't always coexist in a way that makes sense. There's a constant internal tension inside them, a part that leans toward connection, toward closeness, toward everything that felt good, and another part that immediately reacts to that closeness as something overwhelming, something that needs to be controlled before it gets too deep. So even when they miss you, even when they think about reaching out, even when they feel that urge to reconnect, another voice steps in, a quieter but stronger one, telling them it's better not to, telling them it's safer this way, telling them that opening that door again will only lead to the same place they tried to escape from. And over time, that voice becomes the one they listen to, because it protects them from discomfort. It protects them from vulnerability. It protects them from having to face emotions they don't fully understand. But what it also does is keep them stuck in a loop where nothing is fully resolved, where the connection isn't truly gone, but it's also not present, where everything exists in this quiet, unfinished space. And if they were honest, completely honest, without that internal voice interrupting, the message wouldn't be confident or clear. It would be conflicted, because they don't have a simple answer. They don't have a clean explanation. They only have pieces. Pieces of feelings they didn't know how to handle, pieces of moments they still revisit, pieces of a connection that meant something even if they couldn't stay in it. And maybe the hardest part to understand is this: they didn't leave because nothing was there. They left because something was. Something that asked more from them than they knew how to give. Something that required emotional presence, consistency, openness, things that don't come naturally to them. And instead of trying to meet that need, instead of risking failure, instead of facing the possibility that they might not be able to handle it, they chose distance, because distance feels manageable. Distance doesn't ask questions. Distance doesn't require answers. Distance allows them to keep everything contained, even if it means losing something real in the process. And that's the message they'll never fully send. Not because it doesn't exist, but because sending it would require them to confront everything they've been avoiding. And that's a place they're not ready to go. Not yet, and sometimes not ever in the way you're hoping for. Because the part that makes this so difficult to accept isn't just their silence, it's what their silence does to you over time. It keeps you in a state of questioning. It keeps you replaying things, analyzing small details, holding on to moments that felt meaningful, trying to understand where exactly things shifted. And in that process, it's easy to forget something important, that while they're protecting themselves from emotional exposure, you're left carrying the emotional weight of everything that was never said. And that's where things begin to feel unbalanced. Because on your side, the connection likely felt like something that was building, something that was becoming more defined, more real. You felt the progression, you felt the closeness, you felt the moments where it seemed like they were opening up, even if it was subtle. And naturally, you trusted that direction. You believed that what was growing between you had a place to go. But for them, that same progression didn't feel the same way. What felt like connection to you started to feel like pressure to them. Not pressure that you intentionally created, not something you forced, but simply the natural weight of something becoming real. Because when something starts to matter, when it starts to carry emotional significance, it also starts to require something in return. It requires presence. It requires consistency. It requires the willingness to stay, even when things aren't perfectly comfortable. And that's where their internal conflict intensifies, because part of them does want that. Part of them does recognize the value of what you shared, but another part of them, often stronger, often louder, associates that level of closeness with losing control, with being seen too clearly, with reaching a point where they can't easily step back anymore. And for someone who relies on distance to regulate their emotions, that feeling becomes overwhelming. So instead of leaning in, they start to create space. Sometimes it's subtle at first, a slight change in communication, a delay in responses, a shift in tone that's hard to explain but easy to feel. And if you're paying attention, you notice it, you feel that something is different, even if you can't immediately define it, and naturally you try to close that gap. You try to reconnect. You try to bring things back to what they were. Because from your perspective, the connection is still there. It hasn't disappeared. It just feels like it's slipping. But this is the moment where the dynamic quietly changes. Because the more you try to move closer, the more they feel the need to move back. Not because you're doing something wrong, but because your closeness highlights exactly what they're trying to avoid. And this is where the unsent message continues. If I seem distant, it's not because I stopped caring. It's because I don't know how to stay the same when things start to matter this much. That's the part they don't know how to explain. Because even to them, it doesn't always make logical sense. They can feel something real and still feel the urge to escape it at the same time. They can enjoy being close to you and still feel overwhelmed by the expectation that closeness brings. And instead of trying to communicate that confusion, instead of sitting in that discomfort and working through it, they default to what feels familiar. They pull back, and from the outside, it looks like inconsistency. It looks like mixed signals. It looks like someone who doesn't know what they want. But internally, it feels like self-protection, because in their mind, creating distance now feels safer than reaching a point where the connection becomes too deep to manage. And this is where one of the biggest misunderstandings happens, because you start trying to interpret their behavior through your own emotional framework. You assume that if someone cares, they show it consistently. If something matters, they stay. If a connection is real, it doesn't suddenly shift without explanation. And in many cases, that's true. But with someone who avoids emotional vulnerability, those rules don't always apply in the same way. Because their actions aren't always aligned with their feelings, they can feel something strongly and still act in a way that contradicts it. And that contradiction is what creates so much confusion. Because you're not just responding to what they do, you're trying to reconcile it with what you felt from them before. You're trying to understand how someone who once felt so present can suddenly feel so distant without a clear reason. And the truth is, there is a reason. It's just not one they know how to communicate, because to communicate it, they would have to admit something they're not comfortable facing. That they were affected more than they expected. That the connection reached a level they weren't prepared for. That being with you didn't just feel good, it also triggered something deeper, something that challenged their sense of control, something that made them feel exposed in a way they don't know how to handle. And if they were able to say it, honestly, without filtering it through fear or pride, it would sound something like this. It wasn't that you were too much, it's that I didn't know how to handle something real. But instead of saying that, they create distance, because distance allows them to avoid that level of self-awareness. It allows them to simplify something that feels complicated. It allows them to convince themselves that stepping away is the right decision, even if it doesn't fully resolve how they feel. And this is where their internal battle continues, even after they've pulled away. Because creating distance doesn't automatically bring clarity. It doesn't immediately erase the connection. It doesn't suddenly make everything feel easy again. If anything, it creates a different kind of discomfort. One that shows up in quieter ways. They might wonder if they made the right decision. They might think about reaching out, not to restart everything, but just to check, just to see if you're still there. But that thought doesn't last long, because almost immediately it's followed by hesitation. What if you've moved on? What if you don't respond the same way? What if reaching out only makes things more complicated? And most importantly, what if it pulls them back into something they weren't able to handle before? And so the message stays unsent. Not because the thought never crossed their mind, but because every time it does, it's met with resistance. Resistance that feels stronger than the desire to connect. Resistance that tells them it's better to stay silent than to risk reopening something they don't fully understand. And this is where pride quietly plays a role, not in an obvious ego-driven way, but in a protective way. Because silence allows them to maintain a sense of control over how they're perceived. It prevents them from having to admit uncertainty. It prevents them from having to face rejection, or worse, emotional exposure. Because reaching out would require honesty. And honesty, for them, feels like vulnerability. So instead, they hold onto their thoughts privately. They replay moments without sharing them. They feel things without expressing them. They process the connection internally without ever bringing it back into reality. And over time, this becomes their way of coping. not by resolving the connection, but by keeping it at a distance where it can't fully affect them. But that doesn't mean it doesn't exist, because deep down, there's still a part of them that knows, a part that recognizes what the connection was, a part that understands that it wasn't something casual or meaningless, a part that, even if they never admit it, still carries the weight of what was left unfinished. And that's the part that keeps the message alive, even if it's never sent. And that unfinished weight, it doesn't just disappear with time. It changes form, it becomes quieter, less obvious, less urgent, but it lingers in ways that are easy to overlook unless you really understand what's happening beneath the surface. Because from the outside, it might look like they've moved on. It might look like they've fully detached, like whatever you shared has been neatly placed in the past without a second thought. But emotional detachment, especially for someone who avoids vulnerability, isn't always what it seems. Because what looks like moving on is often just emotional suppression done well. They keep themselves occupied, they fill their time, they shift their focus onto things that don't require the same level of emotional depth, and in doing that, they create the appearance of closure without actually experiencing it. And that's why, even long after the connection is ended, something about you can still find its way back into their mind, not in a constant, overwhelming way, but in moments that catch them off guard. A familiar feeling, a situation that reminds them of something you shared, a quiet pause where their mind drifts back without permission, and for a brief second, they reconnect with a version of themselves that existed when you were part of their life. And that's when the illusion of being over it starts to crack. Because if it was truly resolved, it wouldn't come back like that. If it was truly meaningless, it wouldn't still carry emotional weight. But instead of following that feeling, instead of exploring it or trying to understand why it's still there, they do what they've always done. They push it aside. Because acknowledging it would require them to admit something they've been avoiding this entire time, that they didn't fully process what they walked away from, that maybe in their attempt to protect themselves, they also let go of something that mattered more than they realized. And if they were honest in that moment, if they allowed themselves to sit in that realization without shutting it down, the message inside them would sound something like this: I thought I could just move on, but I didn't realize how much of it would stay with me. But again, that message never reaches you, because even when they feel it, they don't translate it into action. They let it pass. They convince themselves it's just a temporary thought. They return to their routine, to their distractions, to the version of themselves that doesn't have to confront anything deeper. And over time, they get better at it, better at ignoring, better at minimizing, better at convincing themselves that what they feel doesn't require a response. But that doesn't mean the connection disappears. It just becomes something they carry quietly. And this is where another layer of truth begins to reveal itself. Because distance for them was never about fully letting go. It was about creating enough space to feel safe again. Safe from expectations, safe from emotional intensity, safe from the possibility of losing control in something that felt unpredictable. But what they don't always realize is that in choosing that safety, they also chose incompleteness. They chose to leave something unresolved. And unresolved emotions have a way of resurfacing no matter how much time passes. Not always in obvious ways. Sometimes it shows up as comparison. They meet someone new and something feels different, but they can't quite explain why. Not necessarily worse, not necessarily better, just different in a way that feels like something is missing. And they don't immediately connect that feeling back to you. But it's there because what they experienced with you set a reference point, a standard they didn't fully appreciate in the moment, but can't completely ignore later. And that's when the internal conflict returns in a new form. Because now it's not just about avoiding something intense, it's about recognizing that what they walked away from had a depth they haven't easily found again. And that realization can be unsettling because it challenges the narrative they've been telling themselves. That leaving was the right choice. That distance solved the problem. That everything is simpler now. But if that were completely true, they wouldn't still feel those subtle echoes. They wouldn't still have moments where their mind drifts back. They wouldn't still carry that quiet sense that something was left unfinished. And this is where the message deepens. Because if they allowed themselves to fully acknowledge it, without resistance, without trying to rationalize it away. They might finally admit something they've been holding back for a long time. I didn't realize what I had when I had it, but even that realization doesn't guarantee action because awareness and behavior don't always align for them. They can see something clearly and still not know what to do with it because reaching out now doesn't just involve expressing that realization, it involves facing everything that comes with it. The questions, the explanations, the vulnerability of admitting they may have been wrong, and more than anything, the possibility that you're no longer in the same place, that you've grown, that you've changed, that you may not be open to revisiting something they once walked away from, and that possibility creates hesitation because it introduces a new kind of risk. Not just emotional exposure, but rejection. And for someone who already struggles with vulnerability, that risk can feel overwhelming. So again, they choose silence. Even when part of them wants to break it, even when part of them wonders what would happen if they just reached out, even when part of them knows that not saying anything keeps everything exactly where it is, unresolved. And this is where the mixed signals you may have experienced start to make more sense because their behavior was never about clarity. It was about managing internal overwhelm. When they moved closer, it wasn't accidental. It was because they felt something pulling them in. When they pulled away, it wasn't random. It was because that same feeling became too much to hold. So what looked like inconsistency was actually a pattern of wanting connection, but fearing what it requires, a pattern of stepping in, then stepping out, of feeling, then retreating. And if they were able to explain that honestly, without simplifying it or avoiding it, the message would sound something like this: I wasn't playing games, I just didn't know how to stay. And that's a difficult truth to sit with because it means that what you experienced wasn't fake, but it also means that it wasn't stable. It existed in a space where emotions were real, but the ability to sustain them wasn't. And that's where their deepest fear begins to surface. Not just the fear of being hurt, but the fear of losing themselves in something they can't control. Because for them, emotional closeness can feel consuming. It can feel like something that slowly takes away their independence, their sense of autonomy, their ability to regulate themselves in the way they're used to. And even if that fear isn't fully accurate, even if it's shaped by past experiences more than present reality, it feels real to them, real enough to influence their choices, real enough to make them step back from something meaningful, real enough to keep that message locked inside even when a part of them wants to let it out. And that's the contradiction they live with. Wanting connection, but fearing what comes with it. Remembering you, but choosing not to reach out. Feeling something real, but never fully expressing it. And in the end, that's what keeps everything suspended in that quiet, unfinished space. A space where the message exists, but never quite makes it to you. A space where the message exists, but never quite makes it to you. And after a while, something inside you begins to change. Not all at once, not in a dramatic, obvious way, but slowly, quietly, you start to feel the weight of waiting differently. What once felt like hope begins to feel like uncertainty. What once felt like patience begins to feel like emotional exhaustion. And the silence that once made you lean in closer starts to make you step back. Because there's only so long you can hold space for something that never fully shows up. There's only so many times you can replay the same questions without answers before something inside you begins to ask a different kind of question. Not what are they feeling, but what am I accepting? And that shift is everything. Because up until this point, your focus may have been on understanding them, on decoding their behavior, on trying to make sense of their silence in a way that brings you clarity. And while that understanding matters, it can also keep you emotionally tied to something that isn't moving. Because the truth is, even if you fully understand why they are the way they are, it doesn't change what they're giving you. It doesn't turn silence into communication. It doesn't turn distance into presence. It doesn't turn potential into consistency. And this is the moment where the message you've been trying to hear from them starts to reveal something deeper. Because sometimes what they don't say is the message, not in a harsh or dismissive way, but in a real, grounded way that asks you to see the situation clearly, not just emotionally. Because if someone truly wanted to be present in your life in a consistent, emotionally available way, they would find a way to show it. Not perfectly, not without fear, but in some form that doesn't leave you constantly questioning where you stand. And that doesn't mean they didn't feel something. It doesn't mean the connection wasn't real. It simply means that what they're capable of giving doesn't align with what you need. And that realization can feel heavy because it requires you to let go of the version of the connection that existed in your mind, the one where things eventually make sense, where they come back with clarity, where everything that felt unfinished finally gets resolved. But real growth doesn't come from waiting for that moment. It comes from recognizing when something is showing you exactly what it is, even if it's not what you hoped for. And this is where their final unsent message, the one they may never fully articulate, becomes clearer than ever. Because if they could say it without fear, without pride, without avoiding the truth, it would sound like this: I wish I could be the person you needed, but I don't know how. And as difficult as that is to hear, it's also honest. It doesn't blame you. It doesn't diminish what you shared. It doesn't pretend that nothing was there. It simply acknowledges a limitation, a gap between feeling something and being able to sustain it in a healthy, consistent way. And when you truly understand that, something begins to settle inside you. Not in a way that erases the connection, not in a way that makes everything suddenly easy, but in a way that brings clarity, because you stop waiting for something that was never fully being offered. You stop trying to translate silence into meaning that isn't there. You stop holding on to potential and start seeing reality. And that doesn't make what you felt any less real. If anything, it validates it, because you were able to connect. You were able to feel something genuine. You were able to show up emotionally in a way that many people struggle to. And that's not something to question. That's something to recognize as strength, because the ability to feel deeply, to connect, to invest emotionally isn't the problem. The problem is when that ability is given to someone who can't meet it, and that's where your power comes back. Not in changing them, not in finally getting the message you've been waiting for, but in understanding that you don't need that message to move forward, because everything you needed to understand was already shown to you through their silence, through their distance, through the way things never fully came together the way they should have. And once you see that clearly, something shifts. You no longer feel pulled toward what's unresolved. You no longer feel the same urgency to make sense of it. You begin to detach, not out of anger, not out of bitterness, but out of clarity, because you understand that holding on to something incomplete doesn't complete it. It only keeps you in the same place. And this is where you begin to step into a different version of yourself, one that doesn't chase explanations, one that doesn't wait for consistency from someone who has already shown they struggle to give it, one that values emotional availability, not just emotional intensity, because intensity can feel powerful, it can feel meaningful, it can create moments that stay with you, but without consistency, it doesn't build anything stable. And deep down, that's what you were looking for. Not just connection, but something that could last, something that could grow, something that didn't leave you questioning your place in it. And that's the part that matters most. Because as much as this has been about them, their fears, their silence, their inability to express what they feel, this is also about you, about what you deserve, about what you're willing to accept, about the kind of connection that actually aligns with who you are, not just emotionally, but consistently. And when you fully step into that understanding, the message they never sent loses its hold over you, because you no longer need to hear it. You've already understood it, not through their words, but through their actions. And sometimes that's the clearest message of all.